Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are turning our attention to something that is probably, statistically speaking at least, within about 10 feet of a good chunk of you listening right now. We are talking about the domestic cat.
It is a topic that feels deceptively simple, doesn't it?
Mm.
Because they really are everywhere. I mean, there are about 600 million of them worldwide. They are in our memes, they are on our sofas, they are sleeping on our keyboards. We feel like we know them perfectly.
That is exactly what I thought going into this. I thought, cats, they are cute, fluffy, aloof, they purr. But after spending time with our source material for today, which is the Cat Encyclopedia, the definitive visual guide from DK Publishing, I realized I was looking at this animal completely wrong.
Yeah, that book really flips the script on how we view them.
It really does. So the mission for this deep dive is to peel back that familiarity for you. We want to figure out how a solitary, fierce, hyper-specialized predator from the wild evolved, or well, as we might actually discover, didn't evolve into the companion animal we live with today.
And that didn't evolve part is really the crux of the whole story. The central paradox we are going to explore today is that while we have drastically changed the cat's living situation, moving them from the African savanna to a high-rise apartment, we haven't actually changed the cat.
Right.
Biologically, genetically, and behaviorally, the animal in your lap is almost identical to the wild predator it descended from.
That was the hook for me. This concept of the tiger in the living room isn't just a poetic metaphor. It is a biological reality. And the way they got there is unlike literally any other domestic animal. We didn't drag them in, they invited themselves.
They absolutely did. They are the only animal in human history to self-domesticate. It is a fascinating distinction.
So we have a massive roadmap for this hour. We are going to start with the evolutionary blueprint. We're going to unpack the specific machinery that makes a cat a cat. We need to talk about the family tree, and specifically the mechanical difference between the cats that roar and the cats that purr.
Which is a much more complex physiological trade-off than most people realize.
Definitely. And then we are going to dig into deep time. We will go back 65 million years to find the ancestor of all carnivores and debunk the myth of the saber-toothed tiger. Then we will get into the archaeology that completely rewrites the timeline of domestication. Spoiler alert for you all, it didn't start in Egypt.
No, it didn't. And that discovery fundamentally changes our understanding of the human-cat relationship.
From there, we will track their global conquest via ancient shipping routes, explore the surprisingly complex social lives of feral colonies, which totally destroys the myth that cats are loners, and finally, look at the wild pendulum swing of their cultural status, from being worshipped as literal gods to being burned as demons.
It is a journey that touches on evolutionary biology, anthropology, and even theology.
So let's unpack this. Let's start at the foundational level, the biological blueprint. When we say cat, we are referring to the family Felidae.
Correct. The family Felidae. And it is a remarkably consistent family. There are 37 distinct species, ranging from the Amur tiger, which can weigh up to 600 pounds, all the way down to the rusty-spotted cat, which literally fits in the palm of your hand.
Wow.
But if you stripped away the skin and fur and looked at the skeleton and the musculature, they are almost clones of one another.
So they basically found a design that worked and just scaled it up and down.
Exactly. They are the most hyper-specialized hunters in the carnivore world. I mean, bears are omnivores, dogs are scavengers and hunters, but cats are obligate carnivores. They are meat processing machines.
Let's talk about the tools in that machine, because the source material highlights a few key shared traits that are just brilliant. The claws, for instance.
Oh, the retractile claw is a stroke of evolutionary genius. Most carnivores, like dogs or wolves, have claws that are always out. They wear down as the animal runs across rocks and dirt. But the cat has a mechanism to sheath them.
Kind of like a switchblade.
Precisely like a switchblade. Ligaments hold the claws inside a sheath of skin when the cat is at rest or just walking. This keeps them razor sharp because they aren't constantly scraping against the ground. When the cat attacks, the muscles flex, the ligaments extend, and the claws deploy.
There's one exception though, right?
Yes, the cheetah. The cheetah needs semi-retractable claws for traction at high speeds. They act like track spikes. But for the rest of the family, it is that hidden switchblade design.
And then there are the eyes. I think everyone knows cats have night vision, but reading about the actual mechanics of it was wild.
It all comes down to the structure of the retina. The retina has two types of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Cones are for color and fine detail, while rods are for light sensitivity and motion detection. Humans have a lot of cones, which is why we see such vibrant colors. Cats, on the other hand, are packed with rods.
So they sacrifice color for brightness.
They do. They see the world in somewhat pastel, washed-out colors. But the trade-off is they can see in 1/6 the amount of light that we need. And they have this built-in turbocharger behind the retina called the tapetum lucidum.
Ah, that is the thing that makes their eyes glow in flash photos, right?
Yes, exactly. It is a layer of highly reflective cells right behind the retina. If light enters the eye and happens to miss hitting a rod cell on the way in, it hits the tapetum, bounces back, and passes through the retina a second time.
Giving the eye a second chance to catch the photon.
Right. It is essentially a biological mirror amplifying whatever available light there is in the environment.
That is just incredible engineering. So we have the shared toolkit across the 37 species. But there's a major divide in the family Felidae. We tend to think of it as big cats versus small cats. But the research suggests the real dividing line is acoustic.
It is. This is the split between the subfamily Pantherina and the subfamily Feline. And the distinction isn't just about how big they get. It is about the throat. It is the roarers versus the purrs.
I always thought purring was just, something cats did when they were happy, like smiling. But it is actually a mechanical function of their anatomy.
It comes down to a specific piece of anatomy called the hyoid apparatus. This is a series of small bones that suspend the tongue and the larynx, the voice box, from the skull. In the domestic cat, and actually all the small cats, the hyoid is completely ossified. It is a rigid, hard bone.
Okay, so they have a solid bone structure in the throat. What does that actually do?
That rigidity acts almost like a tuning fork. It allows the vocal folds to vibrate rapidly and continuously as the cat breathes both in and out. That continuous motor sound, the purr, is only possible because that bone is rigid enough to support the vibration during the entire respiratory cycle.
But the big cats, the lions and tigers, they don't have that rigid bone.
No, they made an evolutionary trade-off. In the Pantherini subfamily, part of that hyoid bone is replaced by a long, elastic ligament. It is stretchy. This flexibility allows them to extend the airway and create a much larger resonance chamber.
Which creates the roar.
Exactly. That terrifying, low-frequency sound that can travel for miles across the savanna requires a flexible, stretchable larynx. But because it is flexible, it cannot vibrate quickly enough to create a true purr.
So it is a strict either-or situation. You can be a loud, terrifying broadcaster, or you can be a self-soothing motor. You cannot be both.
Nature forced a choice. I mean, a lion can make a sort of chuffing sound on the exhale when it's happy, but it cannot sustain a continuous two-way purr like a house cat.
And this brings up a massive misconception that I had, and I think most of you listening probably have too. The mountain lion. The puma. I've seen them in the wild, and they are huge. They are terrifying. I just assume they were big cats.
Visually, they are big cats.
Okay.
But taxonomically, the puma is in the feline group.
Yeah.
It is technically the largest of the small cats.
Because it has the rigid bone.
Yes. A mountain lion cannot roar. It screams, it chirps, and yes, it purrs. If you were brave enough to scratch a mountain lion behind the ears and it didn't kill you, it would purr exactly like a house cat, just much louder.
That is a terrifying mental image. A 150-pound cougar purring like a kitten. It really blurs the line between wild and domestic when you realize the underlying machinery is exactly the same.
It does. And to really understand where that machinery came from, we have to look at deep time. We need to go back way before the puma, before the tiger, to the very beginning of the carnivore line.
The outline in the Encyclopedia mentions Specialistes. This is back in the late Cretaceous period, right? Dinosaurs are still stomping around.
Just at the end of their reign, about 65 million years ago. Now, Specialistes was not a cat. It looked more like a tree shrew or maybe a weasel. It was a small, insect-eating mammal scampering around in the underbrush, basically just trying not to get stepped on by a T-Rex.
So how on earth does a little shrew thing become a lion?
It starts with the teeth. Specialistes is the ancestor of the entire order Carnivora, so that includes cats, dogs, bears, weasels, all of them. The defining trait that appeared in Specialistes was the carnassial tooth pair.
I saw the diagram of this in the book. It looks less like a tooth and more like a tool.
It is a tool. Most mammals at the time had flat teeth for grinding up plants, or just sharp little points for crunching bug shells. But Specialistes developed a setup where the fourth upper premolar and the first lower molar slid past each other perfectly.
Like a pair of scissors.
Exactly like a pair of scissors. This is the shearing mechanism. Instead of just crushing food, they could actually slice through meat, tendon, and hide. This was a massive energy breakthrough. Slicing meat is far more efficient than grinding it. It allowed them to extract more calories in a lot less time.
And when the dinosaurs died out, that energy efficiency let them take over.
Precisely. The extinction of the dinosaurs left a massive power vacuum at the very top of the food chain. The world was suddenly open for a new super predator. The descendants of Semilestes, specifically a group called the Miacids, started getting bigger and filling those newly empty niches.
So we go from Semilestes to Miacids. When do we see something that actually looks like a cat?
That happens around 34 million years ago with Proailurus. The name literally translates to before cat. It was about the size of a domestic cat, lived mostly in trees, and had a long tail for balance. Then, around 20 million years ago, we get Pseudolurus, or pseudo-cat.
I love that paleontologists just gave up on creative names. Before cat and fake cat.
It is very descriptive. Pseudolurus is really the pivot point. It is considered the first true cat. It crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Eurasia into North America. It is essentially the grandfather of all modern felines, both the roaring ones and the purring ones.
Okay, we have to address the elephant, or maybe the mammoth in the room here. The saber-toothed tiger, Smilodon. Because in my head, and I think in popular culture generally, the saber-tooth is the ultimate grandfather cat. We just assume our house cats are mini saber-tooths.
That is one of the most persistent myths in evolutionary history. Saber-toothed cats are not the ancestors of modern cats. They are not your cat's grandfather. They are more like a distant great uncle who had no kids and died out completely.
So they're just a dead end.
Completely. They are a separate branch of the family tree that just stopped. But what makes them so fascinating is the concept of convergent evolution.
Can you explain that concept for us?
Convergent evolution is when nature invents the exact same solution to a problem multiple times in completely different lineages, simply because it is a highly effective solution. The source material points out that saber-toothed predators evolved on at least 3 separate occasions in history.
So nature just kept trying to make the giant fangs design work.
Yes. You had the creodonts way back, then the nimravids, which are called false saber-tooths, and then much later the Machaerodontinae, which are the true saber-toothed cats like Smilodon. They all looked incredibly similar, but they weren't directly related to each other.
Why did nature love that design so much? What is the actual advantage of having 6-inch teeth sticking out of your mouth? It seems cumbersome.
It is about specializing in killing very, very large prey. If you want to take down a mammoth or a giant bison, you can't just bite it and hold on like a lion does with a gazelle. You would get crushed. You need to inflict a massive bleeding wound instantly to cause shock and rapid blood loss. Smilodon was a precision instrument for this. It had a jaw that could open 120 degrees. Compare that to a modern lion, which can only open its jaw about 65 degrees.
Wow, it is unhinging its jaw like a snake almost.
It had to, just to clear those massive teeth. It would drive those canines into the soft neck tissue of a mammoth, pull back quickly, and just wait for the animal to bleed out. It was a high-risk, high-reward hunting strategy.
But it failed. I mean, they are gone. Why?
Because it was too specialized. That is the ultimate lesson of the saber-tooth. They were built exclusively to kill megafauna. When the climate changed around 10,000 years ago and the megafauna, the mammoths, the giant sloths all died out, Smilodon suddenly had nothing to eat. Its teeth were too long and brittle to crunch bones, and it was too bulky to chase down fast, agile prey like deer.
So the generalists won the evolutionary lottery.
The generalists absolutely won. The smaller, faster, much more adaptable cats, the ancestors of our modern Felis catus, survived because they could eat anything from a mouse to a rabbit to a bird. They didn't rely on one giant food source.
Which brings us to the ultimate survivor, the Felis sylvestris, the wildcat.
Specifically, Felis sylvestris livica, African wildcat. Exhaustive genetic analysis confirms that all domestic cats today, from the Siamese to the fluffy Maine Coon, descend from this one specific subspecies found in the Near East and North Africa.
So we have this wild animal. It is a survivor. It is a hyper-specialized killer. It has zero need for humans. How do we get from that fierce creature to the animal that is currently screaming at me because I am 5 minutes late serving dinner? This brings us to the self-selection theory, which is wild.
This is fundamental to understanding the cat psyche. If you look at the history of domestication across the board, it is almost always a story of human dominance. We captured horses and raised them to ride. We corralled cows for milk. We took wolf puppies and selectively bred them over generations for obedience.
You gave them jobs. We said, you are going to herd sheep or you are going to pull this heavy plow.
Exactly. We practiced artificial selection. We were the architects of their evolution. But cats are entirely useless for human labor.
I mean, try telling a cat to pull a plow. It's not happening.
You cannot herd them. They don't have a hierarchical pack instinct for us to exploit and become the alpha of. They don't produce milk or wool for us. So, logically, early humans had absolutely no reason to go out, capture them, and try to tame them.
So the theory is that we didn't choose them at all. They chose us.
It is a process called the commensal pathway. It starts with the invention of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, roughly 10,000 years ago. Humans stop wandering as hunter-gatherers and start building permanent settlements. We start farming wheat and barley.
And we build granaries to store it all.
We build huge granaries. And I want you to visualize what a Neolithic granary represents in the natural world. It is a massive, unprecedented concentration of caloric energy. And in nature, concentrated energy always attracts consumers.
Rats and mice.
An absolute explosion of rodents, millions of them. It was a plague. For the humans, this was a disaster. The rodents ate the food supply and spread disease. But for the local wildcats living nearby, it was the greatest all-you-can-eat buffet in planetary history.
It was a free lunch that just never ended.
Exactly. So the African wildcats began to congregate around these human settlements. But here's the evolutionary filter. Only the cats that were slightly less terrified of humans could get close enough to the granaries to feast. The highly skittish ones stayed out in the desert. The bolder, slightly more tolerant ones moved right into the village.
So nature was basically selecting for boldness and a tolerance of human proximity.
Right. And the humans obviously noticed. They looked at their granaries and saw that where the cats were hanging out, the rats were gone. It was a mutual benefit. The humans essentially said, I won't kill you, you eat the rats, we're cool.
That is the contract.
It is classic commensalism. One side benefits, the cat gets endless food and protection from larger predators like wolves, and the other side benefits through pest control. Over hundreds of generations, these bolder cats bred with each other, becoming tamer and tamer, isolating themselves from the truly wild population out in the desert. They self-domesticated to perfectly exploit the human niche.
Which explains so much about why they still feel so independent to us. We didn't break their spirit. They just decided to hang out with us because it was a really good deal for them.
They're essentially freelance contractors who just permanently moved into the office.
Now, for the longest time, the history books and certainly pop culture said this whole process happened in ancient Egypt. We see the statues, the hieroglyphs, the mummies. Egypt owns the cat brand.
Egypt certainly popularized and deified the cat, but the source material highlights a major archaeological discovery that completely rewrites that timeline. It wasn't Egypt 4,000 years ago. It was much, much earlier.
This is the Cyprus discovery. I found this part fascinating.
Yes. In 2004, archaeologists in Cyprus, an island in the Mediterranean, were excavating a Neolithic village called Chilirocombos. They found a grave dating back 9,500 years. That is roughly 7,500 BCE.
That is thousands of years before the pyramids were even a thought.
Easily. In this grave, they found a human skeleton. But buried with a human, carefully arranged just at their feet, was the complete articulated skeleton of an 8-month-old cat.
And this wasn't just a wild cat that accidentally fell in the hole while they were digging it.
No, the arrangement clearly showed intentional care. It was buried specifically with the person, along with valuable stone tools and seashells. It highly implies a close relationship, maybe even pet status. But the real smoking gun is the geography of it all.
Right, because Cyprus is an island.
Exactly. Cats are not native to Cyprus. There were no indigenous wild cats on the island. That means that 9,500 years ago, whoever that human was, they deliberately brought that cat with them on a boat across the Mediterranean Sea.
And you definitely do not bring a spitting, scratching, terrified wild animal on a tiny, precarious Neolithic boat.
You would tear the boat apart or capsize. You only bring an animal you can easily handle, an animal you actually care about. This proves beyond a doubt that cats were already tame and highly significant to humans 5,000 years earlier than we previously thought.
That is such a touching image to think about, a Stone Age human and their cat just crossing the ocean together.
It really confirms that the bond is ancient. And we see similar evidence popping up in China around 5,000 years ago, where isotope analysis of ancient cat bones shows they were heavily eating grain-fed rodents. The pattern is truly global. Wherever humans settled and stored grain, cats eventually showed up.
So, the cats have moved in. They have the job of pest control secured. But how do they go from being local village mousers in the Near East to conquering the entire world? I mean, cats are everywhere today. Australia, the Americas, remote oceanic islands.
This brings us to the global expansion phase. And ironically enough, it was essentially kick-started by a trade embargo.
That cat embargo.
Yes. In ancient Egypt, cats eventually became so incredibly sacred, which we will get to in a bit, that the pharaohs actually banned the export of cats. You could not legally take a cat out of Egypt. They were considered a protected national resource.
But as we know from history, bans usually just create very lucrative black markets.
Exactly. Enter the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were the master seafarers and traders of the ancient Mediterranean. They sailed everywhere: Greece, Italy, Spain, North Africa.
Yeah.
They quickly realized that these tame Egyptian cats were incredibly valuable commodities.
So they basically became international cat smugglers.
Likely, yes. They smuggled them out or acquired them through shadowy back channels and sold them all along the trade routes. Think about it. A rich Greek merchant would pay a very high price for a creature that could effectively protect his expensive grain silos from ruin.
And once they're in Europe, the Romans basically take over the distribution network.
The Romans were the great pragmatists of the ancient world. As the Roman legions marched north, expanding the empire into Gaul and Britain, they brought cats with them specifically to protect the army's massive food supplies. By the time the Roman Empire eventually fell, the domestic cat was firmly established in almost every corner of Europe.
But the real explosion, the jump across the oceans, that comes much later. The age of sail.
This is where we really have to look at the concept of the ship's cat. We tend to think of this today as just a cute maritime tradition,
Right.
but historically, it was a matter of absolute life and death.
I want to paint the picture of a 15th century ship for you all. It is wood, it is constantly damp, it is packed to the brim with flour, hardtack biscuits, and miles of hemp ropes.
It is an absolute paradise for rats. And rats on a ship, on a long voyage, are a catastrophe. They eat the crew's vital provisions, leading directly to starvation. They physically chew through the hemp ropes that hold the sails up, which can cripple the ship in a storm. They spread devastating diseases in very tight quarters. If you didn't control the rats, the ship simply didn't make it to its destination.
So the cat wasn't a pet, it was a piece of essential safety equipment.
Absolutely vital. In fact, maritime insurance companies in that era would often completely refuse to insure a cargo if the ship didn't carry at least one cat. It was considered that necessary for a safe voyage.
So these ships are eventually landing in the New World, in the Americas, and the cats are disembarking.
And often they just jumped ship at the port and never came back. Or the sailors gave them away or traded them to early settlers. That is primarily how the cat colonized North and South America.
There is a specific story about Australia in the material that I just love. It involves a shipwreck.
Ah, yes, the wreck of the Zeewick. It was a Dutch East India Company ship that crashed violently off the coast of Western Australia in 1727. The survivors managed to swim to shore, and the ship's cats remarkably swam right along with them.
I just love the sheer resilience of that.
That is incredible.
Right.
And it is widely believed that these feline survivors established a feral cat population in Australia nearly 50 years before the first British colonists officially arrived. The cats quite literally beat the British to Australia.
Talk about immense adaptability. And that leads us perfectly into the next section, because when we talk about cats surviving a shipwreck or living in the wild, we touch on a very sensitive and often misunderstood topic: the feral cat.
This is where we need to be very, very precise with our definitions because people confuse the terms.
Right. People use stray and feral interchangeably all the time, but they are fundamentally different things.
Completely different. A stray is a pet cat that has been lost or abandoned by an owner. It has been socialized to humans in its past. It might be scared and hiding, but it can usually be rehabilitated and rehomed. A feral cat, however, is a domestic cat, genetically Felis catus, that has fully reverted to the wild state. It has never known human touch.
And the key biological factor here is the socialization window.
Yes. Kittens have a very short, critical window, usually between 2 and 7 weeks of age, where their brain learns what is safe in their environment. If a kitten is born in the wild and never positively interacts with a human during that tiny window, its brain permanently wires itself to view humans purely as dangerous predators.
So you can't just take a 3-year-old feral cat off the street and turn it into a cuddly lap cat.
It is extremely difficult and in most cases almost impossible. They are functionally wild animals living in a domestic cat's body.
No, this is where the research really profoundly challenged my worldview. We have this deep cultural stereotype that cats are solitary. Dogs have packs, cats have attitude. We think they're natural loners who don't need anybody.
That is a myth entirely born from our own artificial living arrangements. We keep cats alone in indoor apartments, so we only see them as solitary. But when you observe feral colonies, where they are allowed to live on their own terms, that myth falls apart completely.
So if there is enough food around, say, near a busy fishing dock or a dairy farm, what does their natural society actually look like?
It is a strict matriarchy. It is a highly structured cooperative society entirely run by the females,
Like a sisterhood.
literally a sisterhood. The core of the colony is a closely bonded group of related females, mothers, daughters, nieces, grandmothers. They bond very intensely. And the most shocking behavior to observe is their co-parenting.
Explain how that works, because this blew my mind.
They actively share parental duties. If two females in the colony have litters at roughly the same time, they will often combine them in a shared hidden nursery den. They will literally nurse each other's kittens.
Wait, they will breastfeed a kitten that isn't even theirs?
Yes, it is a behavior called allosuckling. It ensures that all the kittens in the colony get fed, even if one mother is sick, injured, or out hunting for the day. One female will often stay back to babysit and fiercely guard the den while the others go out to forage.
That is profound altruism. That is simply not the behavior of a selfish, solitary animal.
It gets even more intense when they face a direct threat. If a strange male, a rogue tomcat, comes around the colony, the females will immediately form a defensive phalanx.
Why are they fighting off the male? I mean, aren't they the fathers?
Because distinct from the males are usually solitary and often highly aggressive transients. A strange male will actively try to kill the kittens. It is a grim biological drive. If the kittens die, the female stops lactating and goes back into heat sooner, allowing him to pass on his own genes.
That is incredibly brutal.
Nature often is. So the females band together to dry him off. They fight viciously as a team to protect their shared genetic investment.
It really makes you rethink the cat sleeping on your sofa right now. We think they are aloof and independent, but maybe they are just lonely. Maybe we are the ones who isolated them from their rich, natural social structure.
It is a very valid hypothesis in animal behavior right now. The perceived aloofness might just be a coping mechanism for a highly social animal, essentially living in solitary confinement.
But we also have to acknowledge the very dark side of their efficiency in the wild. When these feral cats are out there fending for themselves, they are absolute super predators. And in some fragile environments, that is a complete disaster.
We have to be honest about their environmental impact. Because they are such perfect, unmodified hunters, remember the night vision, the retractile claws, the silent walking, they can completely devastate native wildlife that simply hasn't evolved to deal with a predator of that caliber.
The source material specifically mentions the kakapo in New Zealand as a prime example.
The kakapo is both a tragedy and a stark lesson. It is a large, flightless, nocturnal parrot. It evolved for millions of years in New Zealand, where there were absolutely no native land mammals. Its only predators were birds of prey, so its evolved defense mechanism, when threatened, was simply to freeze completely still and rely on its green feathers to blend in with the bushes.
Which I guess works pretty well against an eagle scanning from above.
It works perfectly against visually hunting birds. It is completely useless against a cat that hunts primarily by scent and sound. When cats were introduced to New Zealand by European ships, they decimated the kakapo population. The poor bird would just stand frozen in the bush and wait to be eaten.
So it's just a tragic evolutionary mismatch.
Exactly. The kakapo is now critically endangered, surviving only on a few small, heavily guarded islands where cats have been completely eradicated. It is a sobering reminder that the cat is a highly tuned biological weapon, and when we inadvertently drop that weapon into an isolated ecosystem that isn't ready for it, the results are catastrophic.
So we have covered the biological machine, the deep history of domestication, and the complex social reality. Now, I want to pivot to the final pillar of our deep dive, the cultural roller coaster, because I really don't think any other animal has been more intensely loved and more intensely hated in human history.
It is a cultural pendulum that swings violently from living God to literal agent of Satan and then back again. Honestly, it tells us a lot more about human psychology and our own fears than it does about cats.
Let's start with the high point, ancient Egypt. We briefly mentioned the export ban earlier, but the reverence went much, much deeper than that. This wasn't just, oh, we like pets. This was codified theology.
It's centered entirely around the goddess Bastet. Initially, in the early dynastic period, she was actually depicted as a fierce lioness, a war goddess, bloody and terrifying. But as the African wildcat became domesticated and moved peacefully into the Egyptian home, the goddess herself transformed.
She softened along with the animal.
She became the cat-headed woman. She came to represent fertility, protection of the home, music, and motherhood. She became an approachable, beloved deity.
And the civil laws reflected this deep reverence.
The Greek historian Herodotus actually wrote extensively about this when he visited. Killing a cat in Egypt, even accidentally, was a strict capital offense. There are accounts of mob violence erupting in the streets if someone so much as harmed a stray cat.
And the mourning rituals they had were incredibly intense.
Yes, if a family cat died naturally, the entire household would go into a period of deep mourning. And the specific outward sign of that grief was that everyone in the house would shave off their eyebrows.
Imagine walking into work today without eyebrows and having to explain to your boss, well, Fluffy passed away last night.
It really shows the profound depth of the connection. They mummified them, put them in elaborate tiny coffins, gave them grave goods like mummified mice for the afterlife. And we have to address this, we have to talk about the sacrifice industry.
Yeah.
Because this is where the modern mind really recoils in horror.
Yeah, the book details this industry, and it is genuinely shocking. Archaeologists have found mass graves in Egypt with literally millions of cat mummies.
Millions. Entire temple complexes dedicated to it. And when modern scientists recently x-rayed a large batch of these mummies, they found something deeply disturbing. A huge percentage of them were very young kittens, really, and they had their necks deliberately broken.
So these were definitely not beloved household pets that just died of old age and were lovingly preserved.
No, these were bred specifically for the purpose of dying. The temples essentially raised cats on an industrial scale. Pilgrims would travel to the temple, pay the priests a fee for a freshly mummified cat, and offer it to Bastet as a votive offering.
It feels like such a massive contradiction. How can a society worship an animal so deeply, execute people for harming one in the street, and also systematically snap the necks of kittens to sell them in a gift shop?
It absolutely feels contradictory to our modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
But to the ancient Egyptians, it was transactional theology. The physical cat was merely a vessel. By mummifying it and offering it, you were sending a pure messenger directly to the goddess's ear in the afterlife to ask for a favor. The sacredness was entirely in the function of the offering, not necessarily in the individual life of the cat itself. It was a massive economic engine for the temples, just as much as a religious one.
So Egypt eventually falls, Rome rises and falls, and then we hit the Middle Ages in Europe. And the lights basically go out for the cat.
This is the absolute low point, the Dark Ages for felines. As the Christian Church sought to fiercely consolidate power and stamp out any lingering paganism in Europe, they specifically targeted the symbols of those old religions.
And the cat was a potent symbol of the old gods.
Specifically, they were linked to the pagan fertility goddesses. We talked about Bastet, but there was also Freya in Norse mythology. Freya famously rode a chariot pulled by two giant, magical gray cats.
Which, as a side note, modern breeders actually think were the direct ancestors of the modern Norwegian forest cat.
Very likely. But because cats were so deeply linked to these powerful female figures, and by extension to independent women in society like the wise women or local healers of the village, the church began to aggressively demonize them.
This is exactly where we get the pervasive trope of the witch's familiar.
Exactly. It became formalized. Pope Gregory IX in the 13th century issued a papal bull called Vox in Rama. It explicitly described supposed heretical rituals involving devil worship and black cats. Now, it wasn't explicitly in order to kill all cats everywhere, but it was certainly interpreted that way by the fervent, terrified masses. The cat, especially the black cat, literally became viewed as the creeping incarnation of Satan.
And the documented cruelty during this time was horrific.
We won't go into graphic detail here, but cats were systematically tortured, burned at the stake alongside accused witches, and routinely thrown from church towers during religious festivals to symbolize casting out the devil. It was a centuries-long mass persecution.
And there is a very grim, very deadly irony to all of this. By slaughtering their primary predators, they essentially doomed themselves.
It is the ultimate historical example of the law of unintended consequences. You systematically kill the cats, and naturally, the rat population absolutely explodes across Europe. And those rats carry the fleas, and those fleas carry Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes the bubonic plague.
So the Black Death was, at least in part, directly exacerbated by this religious war on cats.
Historians and epidemiologists consider it highly probable. The severe lack of feline predation in the cities allowed the plague-carrying rats to spread much faster and much further than they ever would have otherwise. They essentially removed their only biological shield against the plague.
There is one little glimmer of hope, or at least a clever survival tactic in this dark period. The legend of the M on the tabby cat's forehead.
Yes, I love this bit of folklore. If you look at any standard tabby cat, the stripes on its forehead naturally converge to form a distinct letter M. In the midst of this intense medieval persecution, a protective folklore legend mysteriously emerged, claiming that the M actually stood for Madonna.
The Virgin Mary.
Right. The story went that a little tabby cat climbed into the manger in Bethlehem and purred to comfort the shivering baby Jesus when he was cold. Mary, in deep gratitude, supposedly stroked the cat's forehead and left her divine initial there forever.
That feels like a very clever PR move by desperate cat lovers trying to save their pets.
It was pure survival strategy. You could tell the Inquisitor, look, don't burn this one. He literally has the holy mark of Mary on his head. It gave regular people a somewhat acceptable religious excuse to keep their vital Mausers around without being accused of witchcraft.
Meanwhile, while Europe is completely losing its mind, the Islamic world is treating cats completely differently.
Totally different trajectory. In Islam, cats are highly revered, largely for their meticulous cleanliness. The Prophet Muhammad was a very well-known cat lover. There's a very famous hadith, a recorded tradition, where he found his favorite cat, Musa, sleeping soundly on the sleeve of his prayer robe. Rather than wake the sleeping cat, he supposedly took a knife and cut off his own sleeve.
That is the ultimate, universally relatable, I can't get up because the cat is on me moment.
It really is, and it's set a powerful cultural precedent. Cats are warmly allowed inside mosques to this day. In fact, they are the only animal officially allowed to freely enter the Great Mosque of Mecca. So while Europe was actively burning them at the stake, the Middle East was fiercely protecting and coddling them.
So when does the pendulum finally swing back for the West? When do we stop fearing them and get the modern, obsessed cat fancy culture we have today?
That happens in the Victorian era, the late 19th century. This is when human society fundamentally changed. The Industrial Revolution meant fewer people were farming and more were moving into modern cities. The cat slowly stopped being just a utilitarian piece of farm equipment and became a true indoor companion.
Enter a man named Harrison Weir,
The father of the modern cat fancy. In 1871, he organized the very first modern cat show at the Crystal Palace in London.
This was a huge pivotal moment for the species.
It completely changed their trajectory. Before Weir, a cat was just a cat. It caught mice. But Weir created written standards. He defined specific breeds. He said, okay, this is a Persian, this is a Siamese, and here is exactly why they are beautiful and valuable. He single-handedly turned the cat from a pest controller into a highly prized aesthetic object, a true status symbol for the wealthy.
And from that first cat show, it is basically a straight line to Hello Kitty, Grumpy Cat, and billions of views on cat videos.
Once the cat entered the Victorian parlor, it simply never left.
So we have covered roughly 65 million years of history today. We have looked at the finely tuned biology, the accidental domestication, the horrific persecution, and the modern adoration. When you step back and look at this whole massive picture, what is the ultimate big takeaway for you?
For me, it always comes back to that central idea of pure independence. Think about it. We domesticated dogs, cows, pigs. We fundamentally changed their shapes, their sizes, their instincts. We broke their wills. We made them completely dependent on us for survival. If you release a toy poodle into the deep woods today, it is in serious trouble.
It wouldn't last a week. But the cat.
The cat remains biologically unchanged by our meddling. Underneath the fur, it is still exactly the African wildcat. It walked into our lives 10,000 years ago simply because it wanted the food. It stayed in our houses because it liked the heat of the fire. And it tolerates us today, mostly because we are useful servants.
That is the real aha moment of this whole deep dive. They never actually needed us. They just found us highly convenient.
And we let them stay initially because they were useful for pest control, and then later just because they were beautiful. It is a relationship of mutual consent, which is incredibly rare in the animal kingdom.
I want to leave all of you listening with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over. Going back to that feral colony structure we discussed earlier, next time you look at your cat, sleeping 16 hours a day on your bed, completely ignoring you when you call its name, and you think to yourself, man, he's just a solitary, arrogant jerk. I want you to remember the feral matriarchy.
Remember that out in the wild, without us, they are highly cooperative, they are deeply social, they are selfless mothers and dedicated sisters.
Exactly. Perhaps our modern view of them as aloof loners is just a reflection of how we forced them to live. We took a wonderfully social animal, locked it alone in a square box, and then called it a loner.
Maybe we're the ones who made them lonely. But that makes me wonder about something even more wild. If we are keeping them exclusively indoors now, controlling their breeding entirely for aesthetic traits like flat faces or tiny legs, and feeding them processed kibble instead of mice, Are we finally breaking that 10,000-year commensal contract?
Oh, wow.
Are we actually in the middle of a second wave of evolution? Are we forcefully turning this unchanged wildcat into a truly dependent, artificially selected domesticate right now before our very eyes?
That is a fascinating and slightly terrifying thought to end on. We might be watching the real domestication of the cat happen right now. On that existential note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. I really hope you all look at your mini tiger a little differently tonight.
Thanks so much for listening.
Catch you on the next dive.